Welcome to today's webinar on domestic and family violence and CALD communities. 1-800-RESPECT are glad to welcome your presenter, Maria Demopoulos. Maria is nationally and internationally recognised as an expert on gender equality and violence against women with a particular expertise in working with multicultural communities. Much of her work has been aimed at promoting and enhancing a gendered approach in the ongoing complex legal and political reform processes and in ensuring the meaningful inclusion of diverse women's voices and perspectives in those reform processes. Maria's expert contributions have included knowledge provision and advisory roles in gender justice, advocacy, bridging and supporting participation in mainstream processes, coordination, capacity building, and piloting innovative projects. In 2008, she was appointed by the federal government to the National Council to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posing questions to the presenter at the appropriate times. Please note that case-specific information cannot be answered during this webinar. All other questions can be typed into the chat box, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You will notice I have posted a question pending for your answer. Responses to your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. After the session, you will be directed to an online survey which can help us to improve the running of our future webinars for you. We have already incorporated some great ideas from your feedback, so thank you and keep them coming. We also encourage you to participate in the discussion tool, which you will be redirected to after completing the survey. We will be closing this thread at 2:15 p.m. There are some useful links on this topic on the 1-800-RESPECT webinar page. We will send you out the link in a follow-up email. I'd now like to pass to Maria to begin today's webinar.
Michelle, thank you so much for that. It's rather exciting to be able to do this. I'm a complete novice, but can I say, as someone committed to access and equity, I'm really heartened by the fact that technology is being used to improve access, indeed, to rural and regional areas. So it is particularly exciting to be using these tools. Can I start firstly, as I have made it a commitment to do as a migrant to this country? I want to acknowledge that when we are indeed speaking of multicultural communities, that we have had 50,000 years of cultural diversity and multiculturalism in this country, well over 280 Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander groups. So if I could just pay my respects to the traditional owners of their land and ancestors, both past and present. If I could start perhaps by just giving a bit of a broad overview of what the session might look like. It's going to be a challenge trying to ensure that the broad issues are basically covered, I suppose, in the 30 minutes that we have. But in essence, I want to really set the scene in terms of contextualising family and domestic violence in culturally diverse communities. Culture, one of those words that's often misused, misunderstood. Let's do a bit of an exploration of that, and particularly its impact. One of those things that we often sort of know exists, but it operates at such an unconscious, subconscious level that we miss its unique impact on the way in which people view the world and, of course, particularly their help-seeking behaviour. There are, of course, a number of cultural, structural, economic and institutional barriers that present when we are trying to respond effectively to issues of family and domestic violence in diverse communities. Let's have a look at what they are and, more particularly, how we respond. This notion of cultural competence. I'd like to really explore what that means and to really try and remove some of the various kind of mythologies that surround it. If perhaps we could start, Michelle, with a bit of a poll question around some of the concepts, but in particular, this idea of culture. What is it? There are a number of choices. Is culture indeed an individual's ethnic background? Or perhaps number two, the shared values, beliefs, expectations, attitudes, assumptions and norms that exist in a group who've had similar experiences. Perhaps it's a description of your race. Or finally, maybe it's a shared ethnic background, traditions and languages spoken by a group of people. Again, if you could select which you think best defines this notion of culture. I'm noticing in particular that number 2 is the preferred selection, and those of you who identified that as the correct answer are in fact right. One of the ways in which we understand culture has tended to be as ethnicity. I really want to highlight the point that culture and ethnicity are not the same thing. For example, organisations have culture. Culture is much broader than this idea of ethnicity. Indeed, it's about values, beliefs and expectations. So thank you to all of you for participating in that. Let's get into some more of these terminologies or concepts that tend to get used in this area of work. Certainly one that's full of jargon. We hear acronyms like CALD, NESB and so on. What are they? Culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, a more sort of recent or current acronym, often sort of suggested that it is synonymous with non-English speaking background. It's important to recognise that indeed it isn't. Culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds was a concept designed to address some of the limitations of this idea of NESB or non-English speaking background, predominantly because non-English speaking refers to whether or not the source country from which you have come does or doesn't speak English as the official language. Now, some of you might be surprised to know that recent international research suggests that unlike the view that might be that English is most proficiently spoken in the UK or England more particularly, the OECD suggests that in fact it's India. Now, India, of course, where English is the official language, Indian or people coming from India would be considered to form part of the framework called culturally and linguistically diverse. Non-English speaking background is a specific indicator referring to language as a key barrier to accessing services. So a key distinction there and an important one to recognise. Cultural issues, of course, despite language similarities, still feature and might have quite a profound impact in the way that people understand their new environment. Words like new and emerging communities and newly arrived communities tend to refer to those less established communities where those networks, those important networks, are not so formalised, tend to be groups of people that have arrived in the last 5 years. New and emerging communities in particular are a reference to refugee and humanitarian entrants. Then you might notice some other words like nationality and ethnicity. Again, 2 words that I think are often not well understood. Nationality is a reference to country of birth. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a reference to one's ethnic identity. Now, the 2 may not be the same. If I could use myself as an example, I was born in Greece. I have dual nationality. My ethnicity is Greek. More established communities tend to be a little easier to categorise in that sense. However, with newly arrived communities, an example might be an Iraqi who turns up to your service. You might ask the question of where were you born, one's nationality. The response that you get is Iraq. If you then go on to make an assumption that they are therefore of Iraqi ethnicity, you might find that you're quite wrong. One of the problems, of course, is that this is more than just rhetoric. This is actually an area that can impact on service delivery. So if I was to get on the phone and ring the telephone interpreting services and ask for an Iraqi interpreter, I'm likely to get a response, well, something like this, that says, look, there's actually no Iraqi language, which would be quite right. There is no Iraqi ethnicity. Iraqi is a reference to nationality. The languages I speak may be Arabic, might be Kurdish, I might be Turkoman, and so on. Those distinctions are very important, and particularly with some of our newest communities. An example might be that we use the term South Sudanese. There are well over 18 different ethnic groups of Sudanese speaking more than 30 languages between them. An important distinction in service delivery without a doubt. Then finally, migrant, refugee and asylum seeker. Key distinction between migrant and refugees, of course, is the issue of choice. Migrants choose to come to Australia. They make a conscious choice. They are able to plan in advance. They can bring their belongings with them. They can choose to return home if things don't quite work out. Refugees, on the other hand, are of course forced to leave their country because they're at risk of or have indeed experienced levels of persecution. They leave behind their homes, most of all their belongings, family, friends, and are often forced to flee without any warning, turning up to Australia with little more than the possessions that they left with. In many situations, refugees cannot return home. Asylum seekers, certainly a contentious site for discussion right now, but put simply, asylum seekers are those who have fled their country and have applied for protection as a refugee, but have yet not been deemed to be a refugee as such. As I say, concepts and terms can be important and have implications in terms of service delivery. So what does this mean for Australia's demographic profile? It might not surprise some of you that recently Australia was rated as second only to one other nation in the world, that being Israel, in terms of our current language, ethnicity and religious diversity. In fact, for the first time ever, we now know that 56% of Australia's population growth is the direct result of immigration. What an exciting landscape, a diverse landscape, when you have 24% of Australians born overseas, 8.5 born in a non-English speaking country. Largest groups, still predominantly those born in the UK, although that is dropping. The second one is interesting, and this probably reiterates the point that I tried to make earlier about ethnicity and nationality. If you were to look at that figure of New Zealand, and a very high one, you might think that the largest group of New Zealanders are either Pākehā or Māori people migrating to Australia under the visa arrangements. But in fact, what we now know, when the ABS does indeed ask the question of ethnicity beyond nationality, we've discovered that we're actually talking about Samoans, Tongans, Fijians. One of the problems, of course, in collecting data, and why it becomes so important when we are collecting data to get a sense of who is it that we're servicing out there, is that we make that distinction between ethnicity and nationality. In Victoria just recently, by asking the additional question of ethnicity, we discovered we had 6,000 more Tongans than we originally thought we did. China and India tend to be source countries for skilled migrants, with India more recently now overtaking China as the key source country. It won't surprise you that New South Wales is probably the largest, has the largest number of overseas born, followed by Victoria and Queensland. Religious diversity, of course, is increasingly becoming an issue that one needs to be conscious of when working with diverse communities. The most common non-Christian religions, the ABS tell us, are Buddhism, now accounting for 2.5% of our population, Islam and Hinduism being the third. Having said that, it's really important that much like we would not assume that Christianity is a monolithic religion, Protestants and Catholics are different, I'm sure you'd agree. So too are those groups of religions. Islam, for example, may well mean Shia, Sunni, Alawite, and so on. Of course, migrants, as I said, are different to refugee and humanitarian entrants. And just a quick look at the top 10 countries of birth will highlight that more recently we are tending to move away from Africa as being the primary continent as a source country for refugee and humanitarian entrants to now looking at countries like Burma, Iraq, Afghanistan and Bhutan, countries that historically Australia has not actually received many newly or new and emerging communities. What is important to highlight very briefly here, and we'll go into some more detail, is that whilst many of the refugee and humanitarian entrants coming into Australia have experienced considerable trauma and in some cases torture, don't lose sight of the fact that many are incredibly resilient and have been able to contribute to Australian society in significant ways. And finally, in terms of some of these preliminary comments, it's important that we not make assumptions of homogeneity. We wouldn't do it with an Anglo-Australian. We wouldn't suggest that all Anglo-Australians are the same. We'd look for intersecting categories, things like sex and gender, class differences, age differential, religious diversity, and so on. Two particular groups that highlight intersectionality and why it's so important might be the Women at Risk program or women without permanent residency. The Women at Risk program, of course, is a visa that's available to single women and their children who are particularly vulnerable to victimisation or serious abuse by virtue of their gender. The visa gives them priority access to counselling and other services. And of course, women without permanent residency, or particularly those on spousal visas, might be women who are particularly vulnerable and subjected to ongoing threats or fear of deportation. The process of migration is never easy, and I'm sure those of you who have travelled overseas have realised that adjusting to a new environment is never easy. Acculturation is a key feature of the experience of many migrants and, of course, refugees. Learning a new language, and it has been said that English is one of the hardest languages to learn. Adapting to a new culture, one that perhaps does or doesn't share the value systems. Encountering prejudice or discrimination time and time again through reports put out by the Australian Human Rights Commission and others suggest that these are other issues that these communities also have to deal with. And finally, trying to mediate ties with ethnic communities as well as balancing their lives in the Australian way of life can be quite a challenge. Not surprisingly, intergenerational conflict proves to be quite an issue. Michelle, if I could ask you at this point perhaps to set the scene by showing us a brief clip that the United Nations has developed around global statistics for gender-based violence. This, of course, is the source for our own domestic plans and the various treaties that Australia recognises. Thanks, Michelle. Certainly some rather harrowing statistics, global facts that are very much reflected, unfortunately, at the domestic level. The National Plan, of course, recognises the various issues and complexities confronting women and their children. The National Plan in particular made reference to that intersectional framework that we talked about earlier on and highlighted the specific issues for women and children from culturally diverse backgrounds, recognising the range of barriers that present for CALD women who are experiencing violence. Research, of course, shows us that family violence occurs in every country and society. This is important. There tends to be a view or perhaps a representation that it's religion or culture that's causal of these issues. Can I reiterate, as I have done again and again, culture and religion do not cause family violence. They certainly impact, they certainly affect the way that one might seek support or assistance, but they are not causal. And it's absolutely important that we reject outright appeals for cultural sensitivity and excuses for what is basically violent behaviour. A human rights perspective, as we saw in the UN approach, is absolutely fundamental to our thinking. Let's go to the second poll, which is an appreciation or a series of questions about what are these issues. Why are women from CALD backgrounds less likely to report domestic violence to police or to access mainstream services? Is it because domestic violence is accepted in their culture? Or perhaps their religion prevents them from doing so? Or number three, they prefer to deal with these matters privately. And finally, because of a range of intersecting issues that result from cultural, institutional and systemic barriers. I'm very pleased to see again that the overwhelming majority of you have said number four. Of course, it's a range of these factors that impact, that are both systemic, institutional and cultural. What are some of the cultural barriers? Very quickly, particularly this idea of collectivism and individualism. This is probably the single largest cultural barrier that we've certainly in our sector experienced as a barrier to service provision. Did you know that the word I, the most commonly used word in the English language, cannot be literally translated in most African, most Asian, in fact almost all Aboriginal languages? This means that often the way that people form society is more of a collectivist rather than an individualist perspective. If you think about the Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am, and turn that onto its head as the Ubuntu concept in Africa might do, you are, therefore I am. I only exist in relation to you. That means that concepts of family will vary, that individualist ideas of the way that these things affect me will vary. There are a range of various ways in which collectivism can impact on the way that people seek support. Other issues, of course, like family structure and the extended family, means that we need to reject the assumptions associated with the nuclear family and recognise that the links between families might not be based on biology, but a whole host of other factors. In summary, of course, the various barriers that we know present the fear of deportation or the lack of certainty about immigration status. And here's the important one, the absolute need for service providers to have a bit of an understanding of where the client is coming from, their pre-arrival experiences, the fact that their languages may not even have accredited interpreters, the fact that some of these languages are purely oral, so any attempt to translate is useless. Many of the Sudanese languages, for example, have only recently been preserved by using the Latin script. They're a simply oral community, much more open to oral engagement than communication in writing. It's vital that children are not used to interpret. Often they will experience trauma directly as a result of being placed in those situations. And of course, lack of awareness of rights or fear of police. The UNHCR tells us that indeed many of the sexual assaults that take place in refugee camps have been perpetrated by men in uniform. Little wonder that many women will refuse or feel absolutely deterred by making reports. So finally, what can we actually do to respond? We know what the barriers are. I think we've stated them repeatedly. It's not an easy thing to do, but cultural competence can indeed be the framework that best provides the way forward. So again, final quick poll, Michelle. What is cultural competence? Is it being able to speak the language of the client or working through an interpreter? A set of skills, perhaps some knowledge that reflect an in-depth understanding of the client's culture. A set of skills, knowledge, values and attitudes that individuals, professions, organisations and systems use to work effectively in culturally diverse situations and environments. And finally, sharing the same values and attitudes as the client and demonstrating these in the way that you interact with the client. Again, this is just fantastic, and it really does hearten me considerably to see that we've got absolute majority saying that it is number 4, sharing the same values and attitudes. Why this is a problem, though, when we talk about 4, is that bilingual workers are important. There's no doubt about it. Having the same values and attitudes can indeed support the client, but it's not an absolute imperative. What is, despite the values and attitudes that you might hold, is the capacity to have a set of skills, knowledge, values and attitudes. That means that any one of us, irrespective of our backgrounds or our languages, should be able to meet the needs of our communities. So number 3 is in fact correct, although the importance of sharing attitudes and values cannot be underestimated. So cultural competence then, folks, is indeed the knowledge, the values, the attitudes of organisations to work effectively in diverse situations and environments. What are the core skill sets? And this is important. We often tend to mystify this idea of cultural competence, so much so that people become immobilised by it. The critical factors are these: know thyself, reflective practice, appreciate that the biggest single barrier to effective interaction with diverse communities or diverse individuals is not how much you actually know about the culture of that person. It's how much you know about yourself. It's how much you understand the way in which culture affects your perceptions and views. This is what we call unconscious bias. Keep in mind that these things can't be taught overnight, that they are an ongoing process, a journey, not a destination. Let me quickly challenge you with this idea of unconscious bias. This is Hannah. She walks into your office or perhaps your service. You make an assumption within 3 minutes, even before she's opened her mouth, of who she might be. This is Hannah again, exactly the same woman. All I've done is put something around her head. What assumptions might you now be making? That she's Muslim? Perhaps you might want to draw on the fact that many of the newly arrived communities from Iraq wearing hijab, the Arabic word for head covering, are indeed Christian and not Muslim. Beware of those traps. And finally, what assumptions are we making now? Is this more a statement about our inabilities to respond when the face is hidden? What does it say about our capacity to communicate? Broadly, reflecting cultural competence means fundamentally, first and foremost, that we are addressing our own misconceptions, our own stereotypes about sexual and domestic violence, that we recognise that there are well over 200 languages that are now spoken in this country, in addition to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Having an understanding of the pre-arrival experience and the cultural context is absolutely essential. But be aware of your own decision making. What factors impact? How might that bias affect you? And in essence, how we might then begin to work towards truly accessible services and equitable outcomes for clients. Be aware, folks, that there is a tendency sometimes to think that violence against women is something that happens overseas. The gender equality has now been well and truly achieved in this country. It should be recognised that Australian women in Parliament are now less than those in Afghanistan. And many from Rwanda here in Australia celebrate the fact that Rwanda is the only country in the world with a female-dominated parliament. I hope that it's been useful. I hope that the recognition that it's not what we know about everybody else's culture, first and foremost, it's how much do I understand of my culture and its impact when I am met with a woman and her children seeking my support and assistance to eliminate or at least respond effectively to family and domestic violence.
Wow, thank you, Maria, for that great presentation. There's some really outstanding statistics and interesting demographic profiles to leave you thinking about these communities. Now we're just going to open up for a few questions for Maria to answer. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing the questions into the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. Now we have had one question come through for you, Maria. This question does come from Maria, and she would like to know, how do you see the current Vic Health framework on preventing violence against women and represent the social and economic factors and determinants of violence in CALD women?
Well, that's an easy question to start off with. How much time do you have? Look, I think the idea of prevention is an absolutely vital one. I'm not sure that we've got the determinants right just yet. I think there still is a tendency to not look at culture as an asset, to take a strength-based approach. They're not easy ideas and they're not easy to build into, particularly quantitative measures of prevalence of violence against women and children. But I think we're able to begin that dialogue and discussion, and I'd certainly welcome an opportunity to have a more detailed conversation around those factors. But certainly prevention as a framework we're seeing more and more is something that communities, as part of that collectivist framework, are responding to effectively.
Great, thanks Maria. And just another reminder to all participants online, if you would like to ask Maria a question, please type them into the chat box so she can answer them for you. Okay, so we have had another question come through from Janelle. What are some of the tools we can utilise to challenge violence-supportive attitudes?
By that, I'm assuming that you mean attitudes that might seek to justify on the basis of culture or religion. There are a range of exciting, innovative tools that are being developed. Let me just give you one example. A Victorian-based organisation called the Islamic Women's Welfare Council of Victoria, now the Muslim Women's Centre of Human Rights, recently changed its name, has developed a fabulous tool called Islam Opposes Violence Against Women and Children. Effectively, and in summary, what that group has done is directly challenge the idea that Islam condones violence against women and children by lifting out quotes from the Quran and basically putting them in a series of publications targeted at both women themselves but also at religious leaders. There are other fantastic tools that are being developed at the moment that do the same thing by making reference to the fact that many of these movements are taking place in countries of origin, directly again rejecting the idea that somehow movements against violence against women are Western concepts. This is nothing more than a culturally relativist argument that must be challenged. Overall, any human rights framework that locates the importance of culture in terms of impact and not as an excuse or a cause are important tools. Finally, and I have included this in the resource list that I've provided, is the excellent training program that the United Nations Development Fund have developed called Culture and Human Rights Programming. It's a terrific tool and I can't recommend it enough.
Great, thanks Maria. And do you know which country has the best track record around prevention of violence to women? That's a question that's come through from Rachel.
Yeah, and Rachel, I think that the indicators, it's a little hard to sort of respond, but what the indicators will tell you is where there is gender equality enshrined in law, enforced by our legal and other national institutions, where attitudes are directly challenged, where gender norms are changing and there is a greater level of equality, that's when we will start to see some reduction, if you like, always difficult to measure, as those of you working in the sector would know. But nonetheless, and I use Rwanda as an example, where there is a female-dominated parliament and the female president of that country has worked tirelessly to challenge gender norms that support attitudes that suggest that women and children are deserving of violence or somehow are not as equal as their male counterparts. This is where we start to see change take place, and this is the sort of change that we want to facilitate. Again, and I keep resorting to the importance of a human rights framework, is a recognition that no one should live in fear for their safety or their security. A human rights framework insists that everyone has the right to be free of violence.
Great, and I think you may have just answered some of this question already, but Gia has asked, are you aware of any national training course that is developed specifically for DFV workers working in CALD communities?
Yeah. Look, there are some excellent programs, and you've really caught me on the hop, but I can certainly think of some of the programs that Immigrant Women Speak Out in New South Wales have developed. There's some terrific programs that the Queensland Immigrant Women's Service has developed, particularly looking at sexual assault and the impact of cumulative trauma for the experiences of refugee women. More than happy to provide these to 1-800, but certainly there are some exemplary programs across each of the states and territories, national programs that I think are also being developed as we speak.
Great. And a question has come through from Anna. Is there any visual infographic tools for newly arrived women to discuss gender equality and or VAW with low or little English?
Yeah, and this is where it's important for communities coming from oral traditions where we've found that we can't translate the information, no written form of language exists. There are some international examples. Again, the United Nations Fund has a number of these, but I also recall some very important examples that are being developed by groups within, say, Victoria, where In Touch Multicultural Women's Service has developed a series of pictograms designed to encourage dialogue. What I have found, though, is that intercultural dialogue, the opportunity to create a safe space, an environment where women in a separate environment can speak openly about their experiences with a trusted member of the community, with commitments to confidentiality. These are the sorts of environments that we can facilitate and enable to take place.
Great. Thanks, Maria. We've had some great questions coming through, so please do keep them coming. Viviana's just placed a comment into the box. She says, thank you, Maria, for reminding us that cultural competency is in the end about ourselves. And she'd like to know if you have any ideas on how we can challenge ourselves and our colleagues not to forget that. It's easily done, unfortunately, as we get busy from client to client, from case to case.
Absolutely. But again, I want to highlight the point that I was making earlier on. One of the fundamental errors I think that many of us have made in our own sector is to suggest that cultural diversity is about them, not us. I think if we continue to remind ourselves that all of us are informed by culture, that when we talk of cultural diversity, we're talking about Anglo-Australians just as much as we're talking about any other ethnic or cultural group. So a fundamental sort of shifting from that perspective. It should be remembered that reflective practice or evidence-based decision-making in our response is nothing new. These are exactly the same skill sets that apply when we're talking about this idea of cultural competency. The harder issues, I think, is challenging some of those unconscious biases, those assumptions that we make when we see a woman wearing a burqa. It is worth reminding ourselves as we look around the world that Egyptian women got the vote 100 years before the suffragettes even appeared on the Western landscape. That we might hail and herald the fact that we had a woman as a Prime Minister, short time admittedly, but we might herald that fact when indeed in many parts of the world this is not an unknown phenomena. I think reminding ourselves of this, as you say, is not easy to do, but it is time that we shifted those ideas of us and them to looking very much at notions of cultural diversity as being inclusive, as being about all of us, and fundamentally an obligation for all of us. If we are going to use the rhetoric of human rights, then we need to be implementing the framework itself.
That's great. Thanks, Maria. We have had one more question come through from Georgina. How should policy and lawmakers integrate cultural competency into their work?
Well, I've certainly made it my own mission, I suppose, to work with members of the judiciary. One of the concerns that I had increasingly was this idea of a so-called cultural defence, particularly to domestic homicides, this idea of defendants standing up in court and saying, look, Your Honour, the reason I killed my wife, my family, my children, it's part of my Greek culture. It's actually inherent to me as a Greek man. We've spent a lot of time designing and developing modules within judicial education programs with the support of the National Judicial College and other state bodies. They have been tremendous in removing that idea that culture is causal or somehow an excuse. I'm certainly very heartened by the fact that I think the legal system has shifted considerably over the 20 plus years that I've been working in the sector. I still lament the fact that I think policymakers have yet to grasp the idea that when we talk of cultural diversity and cultural competency, that we need to be talking about this as a key mainstream issue. We need to move away from this idea that cultural competency is an add-on, that it's something separate to our core business, and really recognise, I think, the fact that culturally and linguistically diverse women represent a considerable proportion of this community and this society.
Great. Thanks, Maria. Now, I think we will have time for one more question. That is all the questions we do have in the chat box at the moment, though. So just as a reminder to everybody online, this is your last chance to ask Maria any questions you may have. Now, just while we're waiting for any questions that may come through, I might just take this time to let everyone know about our next webinar. So our next webinar will be presented by Judy Flanagan from Eastern Centre Against Sexual Assault on the topic of responding to sexual assault. So keep Thursday the 19th of December free from 1 until 1:45 p.m. That's Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. And if you would like to attend, we'll be sending that invitation out next week, so keep an eye out in your inboxes. So for any last final questions coming through to that chat box, please send them through. Okay, so we have just had one more question come through from Emma. What is your response to claims that violence against women in Aboriginal communities is a response to the repression and violence of colonisation?
I think, again, as a non-Indigenous woman, I can only support Aboriginal women and sisters who are taking a lead role in this issue. There is no doubt that racism and ongoing violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities impacts profoundly on the way in which violence is experienced. Can I strongly recommend that that people sort of linking up into this webinar take the time to read the works of Jackie Huggins and of various other Aboriginal women like Marcia Langton and so on, who've written prolifically around these issues. for as long as, of course, this country has not signed a treaty with the original inhabitants of this land, then that violence continues. And I think we cannot ignore the broader context while at the same time supporting our Aboriginal sisters in the very strong statement that they're making along with Aboriginal men that violence against Aboriginal women is not to be tolerated.
That's great. Thanks so much, Maria. Now, that looks like we're just about out of time. So thank you so much, Maria, for answering all of those questions. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar and for all of your input. Please stay logged in to take our short online survey, as it does help us to keep topics relevant and improve our future webinars. And we appreciate your feedback greatly. At the end of the survey, you'll be provided with a link to our discussion forum where you can discuss comments in today's webinar. So please note that case-specific information posted on the online discussion will be removed, and Maria cannot answer any case-specific questions. Now, lastly, for all of our webinar presentations, head to YouTube and type in 1-800-RESPECT in the search box to subscribe to our channel. On behalf of the entire 1-800-RESPECT team, I thank you for your support and attendance and wish you a pleasant afternoon. Until next time.